The 6th of April, our top stories tonight. The Australia-New Zealand travel bubble back on, but with a warning to expect last-minute changes. Rain, flooding and landslides leave around 150 dead in East Timor and Indonesia. An elderly PNG man dies in a Queensland hospital from COVID-19 complications. And can the US and Iran claw back the nuclear deal? Talks resume in Vienna later today. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Beverly O'Connor. A little later, Pakistan's National Women's League out in the cold from world football. But first tonight, Europe's top medical group says it has confirmed a link between the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine and extremely rare cases of blood clots. The head of vaccines for the European Medicines Agency reportedly told an Italian newspaper that there is a clear link with the vaccine, but added that they don't know the cause. Confidence in the vaccine has been waning recently after cases of serious blood clots among those who received the jab emerged globally. The EMA is expected to provide an updated review this week. Well, the Trans-Tasman travel bubble is back on, with Australians allowed to enter New Zealand without quarantining from April the 19th, though travellers have been warned to fly under the guidance of flyer beware and expect the possibility of last-minute changes to plans. There are also hopes the bubble could be extended to other nations. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern flagged the possibility of Pacific countries being included.
We haven't made any definitive decision to close off any other opportunities, but however, it is fair to say Trans-Tasman has been a major focus. The next focus for us is opening two-way quarantine-free travel with the Cook Islands. You'll know that we're working towards May. Obviously for Niue, it's a matter of when they consider themselves to be ready. Beyond that, we have no firm plans.
Well, the death toll from devastating floods in Timor-Leste and nearby Indonesian islands is continuing to rise. Around 150 people have been killed, and that figure is likely to climb as more bodies are recovered. There are also fears about the next stage of the crisis as locals grapple with shortages of fresh water and food, as well as the COVID pandemic. Here's our Foreign Affairs reporter, Stephen Jedgetts.
After the roar of water, quiet desolation. This young Indonesian man sifts through photos of family members buried under the rubble of their home, while another recites the names of 3 lost relatives.
Amasgiri.
They are Amasgiri, Bayele, Adasuci, he says. Torrents of mud and debris smashed into dozens of remote villages dotted throughout these mountainous islands in Indonesia's far west, forcing thousands to flee.
Our house is in the mountains. We had to dismantle the roof. We went out through the back door and pulled ourselves out with a rope.
Now the long, hard recovery begins. At least 130 Indonesians have lost their lives, but more bodies are still being pulled out of the mud. In nearby Timor-Leste, just to Australia's north, the death toll has passed 30, but the devastation is more widespread, and locals are now worrying about disease, as well as shortages of food and clean water.
We cannot go to the work. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough food.
That's because the floods also forced thousands in the capital Dili to cram into refuges, breaking a citywide COVID-19 lockdown and stoking fears the pandemic will now rip through the city.
People are extremely vulnerable and it's a really serious situation.
Officials in Canberra and Darwin are also worried, making it clear Australia is poised to answer any calls for help.
We stand ready and willing and able to assist when they know what it is that they will need.
That call may come sooner rather than later. Stephen Jedgetts, ABC News.
A man has died in a Queensland hospital from COVID-19 complications. The 77-year-old man from PNG was flown to Australia on March the 28th for treatment as his condition worsened. Reporter Josh Robertson has more.
He spent 10 days in the ICU in Redcliffe Hospital, just north of Brisbane, but unfortunately his condition obviously deteriorated and he died yesterday. Authorities have just released those details of his death. Now, that is the first COVID-related death or death from COVID complications caused by COVID-19 in Queensland in a year. But the official death toll will remain at 6, authorities say, because he was diagnosed in PNG. It shows the challenges in dealing with some of the more vulnerable patients, including people of that gentleman's age. There is a concern among authorities here that the number of identified COVID cases in PNG are being unreported because that country is not conducting mass testing. They say that a number of COVID positive and potentially COVID positive patients have already been transferred to Queensland hospitals for treatment since the pandemic began. This is the first death of this kind. The numbers of infections in PNG have, topped 5,000. Now the deaths are heading towards 100. Just days ago, Queensland's Chief Health Officer, Jeanette Young, stated that she was very concerned that PNG had done such a good job managing the pandemic for so long. But recently, there is genuine concern about those infections spiking and not being detected. There's also a lot of crossover between people in PNG and Queensland, a lot of fly-in, fly-out workers. They had to tighten restrictions on people entering from PNG because of concern about the worsening situation. A lot of people are going directly to hotel quarantine and, of course, to hospital.
Well, the Kremlin says opposition leader Alexei Navalny will receive treatment in prison if he is ill. The prominent critic of President Vladimir Putin says he has a high temperature and a bad cough and that there is a tuberculosis outbreak in his prison. His personal doctor was denied access to see him.
We need to get him to a specialised hospital. According to all standards, he has a fever and a cough. What do we need to do now? We need to get a CT scan of his lungs because, God forbid, a coronavirus infection could happen in the prison. This is quite possible.
Earlier, Russian officials released this video appearing to show Mr. Navalny looking well, despite him declaring a hunger strike and saying he has been denied treatment. Meanwhile, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed a law that will potentially allow him to hold on to power until the year 2036. The 68-year-old has been in power for more than 20 years, longer than any other Kremlin leader since Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, who ruled for 29 years. 2 weeks after Israel's inconclusive election, the country's president has asked the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to try and form a new government. Mr. Netanyahu now has 4 to 6 weeks to try and put his coalition together. It comes just after the Prime Minister appeared in court for the first day of evidence in his corruption trial. He's denied the accusations of bribery, breach of trust and fraud, calling the trial a witch hunt. The allegations include accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts from wealthy friends like the Australian billionaire James Packer while in office. The Mozambique army says the coastal town of Palma, which was attacked by insurgents linked to IS 2 weeks ago, is now secure. Aid groups believe tens of thousands of people have been displaced, with many fleeing to safety in dense forest. Here's Yvonne Young.
The northern Mozambique town of Palma left in ruins by militant extremists. It's been 2 weeks since a deadly attack, but the army aren't taking any chances. Soldiers here are keeping guard over 3 men who they say have been acting suspiciously.
We are here with our troops and we feel okay.
Officials say they've secured the area and it's now safe.
We've completed the clearing of the town. It was the only sensitive area that we needed to clear. It's completely safe. If we need to bring in any planes with food for the population, that can be done with no problem. It's secure.
Residents say they're hungry after having to flee their homes to safety. Many were forced to hide in the bush for days.
So I started to run away to my home. I went to pick up my family, my wife and the kids, all of them. Then we went to the bush for the people that was following us in the back.
They shoot people, even they're following us, shooting us. Then we run away.
The insurgents are linked to the Islamic State group and have been increasingly active in the province since 2017. It's unclear what specifically they're fighting for. but their attacks have contributed to a deepening humanitarian crisis. Over the past year, the number of people displaced has increased sevenfold to more than 670,000. They've also threatened multi-billion-dollar investments from French oil company Total, which has now evacuated workers from its construction sites. Despite guarantees of safety from authorities, it's not clear when the firm will resume its investment. Yvonne Yong, ABC News.
Well, later today, Iran and the US are expected to informally discuss the possible revival of its 2015 nuclear deal. The accord's economic measures were aimed at making it harder for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, but in 2018 it fell apart after the former President Donald Trump pulled out. Now, while the Biden administration is determined to reintroduce the measure, it does remain at odds with Tehran over who should take the first step. Let's go live to London, and we're joined by Sahil Shah, a policy fellow at the European Leadership Network. Sahil, great to talk to you. Let's look at these talks, how they've come about and what we can expect from them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. The talks are actually beginning very soon, within, I believe, half an hour. And it's the first time since last September that the remaining parties in the 2015 nuclear deal that you just outlined will be reconvening in person. So there have been discussions over the past 6 months at various points between different participants in the deal and the European Union as the coordinator of it. But this is the first time since last September they'll be all together. The goal is to outline two different roadmaps. On one hand, how the U.S. can restore its full implementation of obligations, and on the other hand, how Iran can also do the same. The Iranian steps are a lot easier probably to chart out because they're technically verifiable and will be monitored, whereas undoing some of the sanctions that Trump put in place may pose to be a bit more difficult, but they're crucial to getting Iran to reciprocate.
So how likely is it that what will be outlined by the US, who of course are on the sidelines, as we pointed out, will it go back to the Obama era approach? And is it likely that they are going to be able to de-escalate the situation?
I'm definitely optimistic that we'll be able to get the nuclear deal restored. I think that there is political willpower now to try to fight for that kind of an outcome, both in Washington and Tehran. Ironically, there's sort of a mirror image between both of the capitals where there are domestic opponents for any form of diplomacy with the other side. So it's going to be an uphill battle. In terms of comparing what the Biden administration's approach is to the Obama administration, the Obama administration, created the deal and began to implement it and said, let's travel hopefully. Unfortunately, because of the past 4 years, when Trump was president, things have changed. The deal before was created on the premise that we didn't trust Iran and that we needed to verify that Iran would live up to its obligations. Well, now the party that doesn't have any credibility is the United States, and by extension, unfortunately, Europeans who haven't been able to live up to their end of the bargain either. So there's a bit of a rebalancing at play, which changes the political dimensions to it. But I think it could lead to an even stronger conclusion. Maybe everybody will walk away with a better understanding of what it means for this to be a win-win deal.
Indeed. And what about the Iranian elections that are coming up? I mean, is it going to be hard because it domestically plays quite well if they are up in arms with the rest of the world?
Well, definitely, there are concerns about what's going to happen in June in terms of if we have a shift on the political spectrum of who is going to be taking over, it then calls into question the sustainability of the process that is underway to get the deal revived. So that's why it's so important that these countries move quickly, that they put the roadmaps together, they consult with the United States, get their agreement on them, and that everybody gets to work. Because if we get into a situation where the discussions move at a snail's pace and implementation of restoring it then falls between both the current and maybe a future Iranian administration, things could get a bit messy. So I think that it's possible to get it done. within the next 2 to 3 months, but it really requires some swift action this week in Vienna.
Indeed. And in terms of how Iran has wound back the progress that had been made in terms of nuclear enrichment, how far down the track do you believe it is?
So Iran has definitely increased some of its capabilities and stockpiles, but luckily everything that they've done is technically reversible from a non-proliferation standpoint. The one thing that is an area of concern is the research and development that they've engaged in. Under the deal, they are able to do some of that, but some of what they've done has exceeded the limits. And unfortunately, when you learn something, you can't remove it from your head. So that's one area. But to be honest, at the end of the day, if we are able to verify their capabilities and stockpiles, what they know doesn't matter if they can't put it into practice. So I think that will be a resolvable issue. And everything else, we should be able to get a resolution on as well.
Great to talk, Sahil. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's return to our top story with Australians able to travel to New Zealand without quarantining as the Trans-Tasman travel bubble finally gets the green light. Now, the full reopening of Australia's busiest international air route will deliver a multi-billion-dollar boost to the tourism and aviation sectors for both nations. Here's political reporter James Glenday.
Come on, Aotearoa. Do something you've never done before.
For the past year, Kiwis have been encouraged to explore their own backyard to boost domestic tourism.
Do something new, New Zealand.
But catchy jingles haven't been enough to support struggling speedboat operators, beachside businesses, vineyards and ski slopes. Australians made up 40% of the country's pre-pandemic international visitors. And today, the nation's Prime Minister declared she's now ready to welcome us back.
We are a safe place to bring your family to come and visit.
A Trans-Tasman COVID-safe travel bubble has been discussed for about a year, though it's currently still a one-way affair. Kiwis can fly to all states, bar Western Australia, quarantine-free, and about 34,000 have arrived since mid-October. From the 19th of April, the favour will finally be returned. Travellers from Australia will no longer have to spend 2 weeks in what's called managed isolation.
This is an important first step. Australia and New Zealand have led the way when it comes to managing COVID.
Within a fortnight, Qantas and Jetstar will return to their pre-COVID schedules, operating 122 flights a week and adding routes from Cairns and the Gold Coast. But Virgin won't return to normal service before the end of October. In Sydney, recent arrivals from New Zealand welcome the news.
Oh, it's really exciting. There's part of me that thinks, is it for real?
In Tasmania's Tamar Valley, there are concerns the state's shortage of hire cars could put some Kiwis off.
People are coming to Tassie, we're advertising it everywhere, yet they can't get around the state.
But the biggest obstacle to the bubble's success remains a fresh COVID-19 outbreak. And in Auckland, many feared travellers could end up stranded.
No. No, I wouldn't take that risk.
Getting stuck over there isn't particularly appealing either. It's just probably not going to happen.
Here in Canberra, some of the initial enthusiasm for a travel bubble has been diminished by the reality that borders might continue to temporarily close and then open again. Widespread vaccination is the only real long-term cure for that. And of course, Australia's program is currently behind schedule. Nonetheless, aviation and tourism groups say there are many reasons to be positive.
Most of the New Zealanders that come here for leisure will probably go to Queensland, so Queensland will get a beach boost out of this.
They believe if the Trans-Tasman scheme is a success, then similar arrangements with countries like Singapore and South Korea may be possible. Though, given how long this bubble has taken to get off the ground, few would be seriously planning a holiday elsewhere just yet. James Glenday, ABC News, Canberra.
The federal government is continuing to defend its troubled rollout of COVID-19 vaccines, insisting that delays are the fault of overseas supplies. It's also been revealed that more than 2 million locally produced doses are yet to be distributed because they are still being tested. Here's national medical reporter Sophie Scott.
Many Australians are keen to be vaccinated, but GP clinics are low on supply. Now it's been revealed CSL has 2.5 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine in cold storage waiting to be tested.
Once the vials are produced, they have to go through an approval process. And that's important because Australians need to be assured of these vaccines and that they are ticking all the boxes.
Australia essentially has its vaccine eggs in the AstraZeneca basket, so when there's a problem with supply or questions around the safety of the vaccine, there's nothing much we can do about it.
Our rollout hasn't been smooth. Pfizer shots were accidentally delivered to this North Queensland nursing home. It's had to return the vials, despite residents being in the highest priority group. Members of the Lancet COVID-19 Commission warn ongoing delays could be disastrous.
Unfortunately, with COVID-19, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that means we really need to ensure that all countries have equal access to the vaccine.
And in places where the vaccine is being rolled out, there's a new risk: complacency.
That does raise the risk that COVID will spread, that will get new mutations that are then resistant against vaccines or more infectious.
That's already being seen, with the AstraZeneca vaccine less effective against the South African variant. What could help is continuing compliance with measures including continued mask wearing, ensuring frontline staff have appropriate personal protective equipment, maintaining proper ventilation in buildings, continued physical distancing, and maintaining strong contact tracing and isolation of cases. And for vaccine manufacturers to drop their patents to boost supply.
In our region, India, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Vietnam and Indonesia can all manufacture vaccines. They can't manufacture the COVID vaccines until they have a licensing agreement.
CSL says more vaccines are coming, with hundreds of thousands more doses to be released here this week. Sophie Scott, ABC News.
Tomorrow, the Chinese embassy in Canberra will hold a press conference addressing concerns over the treatment of minority Uyghurs. It comes after recent parliamentary debate about claims of atrocities in Xinjiang, which China continues to vehemently deny. International editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Hartcher, says China is pushing back against the global condemnation of the alleged human rights abuses in the region.
We're told that the Chinese embassy will be hosting an interactive press conference between Australian journalists in Canberra with Uyghurs in Xinjiang province in China. The Uyghurs will no doubt be set up by the Chinese government to tell the true story of the vocational re-education centres, these marvellous career opportunities that the Uyghur minorities are supposedly being offered through the detention centres set up in Xinjiang province. That's the intention of the Chinese embassy. It's a part of a larger charm campaign, information campaign, pushback campaign really, against the global condemnation and the sanctions that are now organically springing up in parliaments of countries, companies around the world.
So do you think that offers a growing momentum for the government to call it out as genocide, as many other countries have already?
Well, we saw in the Australian Parliament 2 weeks ago, Bev, a debate which was allowed to run for just 1 hour. And the debate was based on a resolution put up as a private member's bill. Private members' bills normally don't get heard at all. But this was a bipartisan bill put up by Kevin Andrews for the Liberal Party, Chris Hayes for the Labor Party. In the allotted hour, a dozen MPs from both parties spoke, and it was a resolution to condemn what it called the serious and systematic violation of the human rights of the Uyghur population of China, to call for a UN investigation of those violations and to call for an examination of possible trade sanctions. Now, there are many more than that dozen wanted to speak. If it had been allowed to run fully, there would have been dozens more Australian MPs speaking to that motion. It was, however, a carefully controlled effort to prevent the Australian Parliament from going where the US Congress, the Dutch Parliament, Canadian Parliament have gone, and that is to a full condemnation and classification of the treatment of the Uyghurs by China as genocide. This was the Australian government actually managing the debate to keep it to a condemnation of human rights abuses that did not actually go that next step to genocide, and was trying to contain the pressure in the Australian Parliament for pressure against China. So that's where it's up to. To answer your question more directly, I suppose, the Chinese embassy tomorrow by promoting the fiction that this is just a nice vocational retraining opportunity and that these people haven't been subject to shocking repression for years, is a kind of provocation, really, to the Australian public, the Parliament, the media, to respond. So it may actually backfire and provoke yet more criticism and awareness of the Chinese repression of its Uyghur minority.
Talking of another area of grave concern, and that's the brutal crackdown in Myanmar, regional powers have not done anything significant to try and impact the military junta. What have you made of the Australian government's efforts?
Well, after an initial hesitation of a month or more, the Australian government did issue some modest sanctions, announced some modest sanctions against the military dictatorship. The Australian government hasn't been doing much since that anybody can detect. The Foreign Affairs Minister has had some criticisms of the military takeover, but really not injected herself any further. There is an opportunity for Australia to do something, I would suggest to you. And in fact, an Australian MP, Dave Sharma, Liberal MP, former diplomat, is convening a meeting of a parliamentary subcommittee on foreign affairs next week, which I think is designed to bring some focus and pressure onto his own government, the Morrison government, to get more active on this, because Australia does have convening power if it chooses. ASEAN's having trouble getting itself organised. Nobody's really bringing this to an end to any sort of mediation. The Australian government does have the power, if it chooses to use it, to have some convening opportunity to bring parties together, to get a negotiation, to get a settlement, at least to get the parties around the table, the local as well as regional parties around the table. And in these situations, somebody really needs to, nobody is, the opportunity is there, and Australia seems pretty inert on this, as it's been on a lot of other regional issues in recent times, unfortunately.
Yeah, indeed. And do you think the protest movement is going to be able to sustain its opposition?
The protest movement's actually developed really quite interestingly in the last week or two, where it's gone from being the NLD, the National League for Democracy, which is the Aung San Suu Kyi party, plus the street protests and civil society against the military, has now enlarged itself by being met or joined by the biggest ethnic armed minorities. So the ethnic insurgencies, which have been pretty much dormant for the last 20 years, you know, the Karen, the Kachin, the Rohingyas and others, are now allowing their peace deals with the military regime to lapse. They're declaring their opposition to the military dictatorship. They are joining in a kind of a joint united front government, or a parallel government, or a united front, together with Aung San Suu Kyi's party, together with civil society, bringing the big ethnic rebel groups together with them to form a national front. And really that's isolating the Tatmadaw, the military in Myanmar. And this is new. This is very new. Those armed ethnic militia groups have between 75,000 and 100,000 fighters. They control perhaps a third of the national population. To have those groups on the one hand included with Aung San Suu Kyi's regime, the former regime, and the civil society and all the other groups that we've seen protesting, starts to isolate the military, threatens to overwhelm the military, and also threatens to bring on what the UN envoy has feared is going to be a bloodbath. Yeah.
Good to talk, Peter. Quite disturbing. We'll watch with interest. Thanks so much.
Indeed. Pleasure.
Well, steam and lava are pouring from a new fissure on a volcano in Iceland. Hundreds who came to visit the spectacle have been moved away from the area. The long-dormant volcano flared to life last month after tens of thousands of earthquakes were recorded. It was the area's first volcanic eruption in nearly 800 years. Well, to what in the world? And while there are perils with every job, TV presenting can be a tough gig. When something goes wrong, everyone at home sees it and it can go viral. Well, that was certainly the case with this Russian reporter who had a surprise guest during this live weather cross.
Здравствуйте, Ирина. Ну, действительно, в столичный регион пришла весна. Столбики термометров будут показывать на этой неделе до 8 плюс 9 градусов. Стоять! Иди сюда! Эй, стой! Стой! Стоять!
That video is understandably being viewed millions of times online, including this golden retrieval from the presenter grabbing her mic back, albeit a little damaged, and even appeared alongside her surprise guest later in the show. Our top stories tonight on The World. Jacinda Ardern reveals quarantine-free travel between Australia and New Zealand will start on April the 19th, but travellers have been warned to expect last-minute changes to plans. A senior official at the European Medicines Agency says there is a link between the AstraZeneca vaccine and extremely rare cases of blood clots, but there was still no certainty about what exactly was causing the reaction. And the Kremlin says Alexei Navalny will receive treatment in prison if he's ill, but the opposition leader claims his doctor has not been allowed to see him. Well, North Korea says it will not be sending a team to the Tokyo Games to protect its athletes from the coronavirus. The country's sports ministry made the announcement online following a meeting with the North Korean sport minister. The meeting also discussed North Korea's 5-year plan to improve sport technologies and earn more international medals. Japan has responded, saying it's monitoring the situation closely. Well, Pakistan's national women's football tournament has been thrown into doubt in an ongoing spat between the country's governing football body and FIFA. The Pakistan Football Federation is facing sanctions and possible expulsion from the World Game after it rejected efforts to bring it back into line with FIFA's rules. Over the weekend, officials forced a takeover of the federation's headquarters after the organisation's leader refused to give up control. The incident forced the cancellation of the National Women's Football Championship in Karachi, with 19 teams unable to compete. Now, the federation restarted the tournament, but it's not recognised by FIFA. One of those footballers caught up in the middle of the feud is Abiha Haidar, and she joins us now from Pakistan's capital, Islamabad. Abiha, good to talk with you. Now, just how many of the women's teams have been able to resume play?
Hello, thank you for having me on the show. Right now we haven't resumed playing. We are back in our own cities, just waiting for the matter to be resolved.
And how do you think this is going to be resolved? It would seem that this person who's taken control is at odds with FIFA.
For me, I guess all the players have one stance, that the two competing parties right now should sit together and find a neutral way for that, which would not affect the football in the country, which would not affect the footballers' future, and which would not implement a ban upon us on FIFA. So I guess both of the parties right now should sit together, bring out a neutral position, and think about the future of football and stop letting it to be banned.
Why is FIFA membership so important to Pakistan?
The FIFA membership is obviously important because that is what allows us to compete internationally in the international tournaments. Pakistan has a women national team. Pakistan has a men national football team. Pakistan has under 16, under 19, under 21 football teams which consist of immensely talented footballers, youngsters. The FIFA membership right now allows us all to compete internationally in the football tournaments, in the footballing arena, and to secure our footballing futures from that. If we are banned by FIFA, we won't be able to compete in any international tournament, and that brings us to a start of all the footballers, all the footballing arena coming upon an end on us in Pakistan.
Yeah. Give me a sense of how the cancellation of your national league affected you personally.
Actually, in Pakistan, playing sports is like a major maneuver, a major stereotype we break each day, because it isn't easy for a woman or for a girl to step out of her house and to go into the fields and play a sport, let alone a sport like football that is basically a male-dominated sport. So every day we fight through a lot of odds. We sacrifice our studies, we sacrifice our jobs. Personally, I resigned from 2 jobs while going into this tournament because none of my employers were comfortable giving me a 1 month leave. For both of them, for both of my offices, football wasn't important at all. But my passion lies in football. So I resigned my jobs. I went to the tournament, to the championships. And at the semi-final stage, the championship came to an end. I came back to my city, and right now, neither do I have any standing in football, nor do I have any job in hand. So that is how it affects us on a regular basis, because we as players make so much sacrifices just to be able to compete in the field and to be able to get on that position where we represent Pakistan internationally. But such politics, such upsetting events come in between, and then it affects only and only us.
Yeah. And Abiha, did you, when you were playing, were you getting compensated in any way?
No. We as players in Pakistan, we play just for the love of the game. Our football hasn't reached on that level where we are compensated or where we are paid on a regular basis from football. We play football for the love of the game, for the love of us representing Pakistan internationally. That is what it is. And where there is a talented girl or a talented boy who have to financially support their families, but who are also immensely talented in football, when a point comes where they have to choose between football or per se being a sport teacher, they leave football. They leave all their talent, they leave all their passion because of the fact that we do not get paid from football. We play football because we have love for the game, we have passion for the game, and because we want to represent our country internationally in the field of that sport.
And do you get the feeling that the Pakistan officials too are working against women's football, or were you just unfortunate victims of what has happened?
I guess we are right now, we are unfortunate victims. We just gambled in between the political fiasco right now, because whatever is happening is affecting each and every footballer. It is affecting the men's team equally. It is affecting the women's team equally. The event timing maybe could have been better for the other party, because it was only 3 days for our tournament to come to an end. We were actually at our semi-final stage. So literally 3 to 4 days and the tournament would have been concluded. We would have been played a national official tournament. But right at the end stage, 3 days before the tournament, the collision happened, the conflict happened, and all our struggle, all our hard work since the past 6-7 months while we were preparing for this championship, and that 1 month where we stayed in Karachi for this championship, where we were playing the matches, all it came to a disastrous end because of this result right 3 days before the end of the championship.
Yeah. And just, you've talked about just how hard it has been to even establish the Women's League and how much you sacrifice as women. What about what you represent more broadly for women in Pakistan? Abihat, did you hear me?
No, I'm sorry, the voice got cut off. Can you come again,
that's
please?
okay. I was just saying, I wonder what implications it has more broadly for women, because you're such role models and trailblazers in Pakistan.
Sorry, just once again, please. I'm so sorry.
Yes, okay. I'll just say more broadly, how does it impact women? Because you do try and be role models for other women in society there. No. But Abiha, it sounds like perhaps we're getting...
I guess for me, when I started playing football back into
Go ahead.
I guess for me, when I started playing football back in 2009, I did not have any role model pertaining to the women football towards who I should have looked upon. That was the very time I decided that I would make myself to become one such role model, when I could be a guideline for all the youngsters, when I could be a figure for the youngsters, when I could inspire the youngsters. And I guess right now, every day my fight is not for me, not for only the football team, but for all the youngsters coming ahead, because they should not see what we are seeing. They do not deserve to see what we are seeing right now. And if any of them have the talent of football, they should actually exercise it towards the greater good of the country, towards the greater good of their future. So right now, I am fighting this fight. I am voicing about this whole scenario, or about the football, or for the betterment of the future of football in Pakistan, just because of the fact that I care about my younger generations, I care about my youngsters, and I do not really want their futures to come to a disastrous end, like might my future coming to an end like that.
Well, I hope it gets resolved soon. Abiha, thanks for joining us. Well, the Minneapolis police chief has testified that former officer Derek Chauvin violated department policy, ethics and values when he continued to pin George Floyd to the ground after he'd stopped resisting. Madera Arradondo, the city's first black chief, told the court he was alarmed when he first saw a bystander's video of Chauvin kneeling on the neck of Mr. Floyd for more than 9 minutes. He said Derek Chauvin, who is facing murder and manslaughter charges, did not follow police training.
Once Mr. Floyd had stopped resisting, and certainly once he was in distress and trying to verbalize that, that should have stopped.
The defence argues the officer did what he was trained to do and says George Floyd died because of his use of illegal drugs and underlying health conditions. Now, just a warning, this next story does contain confronting images. Activists have gathered outside a New York court ahead of a hearing for a man charged with assaulting an elderly Asian woman. Protesters called for an end to the recent surge in anti-Asian hate crimes across the country. Brandon Elliott was captured on CCTV kicking the 65-year-old woman to the ground and then repeatedly kicking her in the head and body. Elliott, who is on lifetime parole after serving a prison term for murdering his mother, was arraigned last week on hate crime charges. Well, the Biden administration is preparing to lead an international campaign to slow or stop cuts in company tax rates around the globe. Countries have been jostling to undercut each other's corporate taxes for decades to lure more business their way. But the US President and his Treasury Secretary are signalling that they are serious about bringing an end to the trend. Correspondent Greg Jennett has more from Washington.
This is quite an ambition that Joe Biden has set for his administration, driven in part by necessity, because it's a matter of record now that his administration has unleashed about 2.3 trillion Australian dollars in pandemic relief, and there's more to come in an infrastructure spending package as well. Now, not all of that can be or will be paid for by increasing taxes, but at least part of it Joe Biden wants to fund by higher corporate taxes. So this is to reverse something that Donald Trump's administration had delivered, bringing the company tax rate down from above 30 cents in the dollar down to 21 cents in the dollar, and Joe Biden wants to take it back towards 28 cents if he can achieve that on Capitol Hill. So he has lots of arguments about the need to reverse this trend, which, let's face it, has been going on for decades, but one that he makes quite forcefully is that companies shouldn't complain about this because, as he pointed out today, only a few of the very wealthiest American companies are paying much corporate tax anyway.
We were talking about a 28% tax that everybody thought was just fair enough for everybody. The idea is here you have 51 or 52 corporations of the Fortune 500 haven't paid a single penny in tax for 3 years. Come on, man.
Yeah, so this is not just a domestic agenda, although that's Joe Biden's starting position. What they don't want to do in the process of taking the corporate tax rate back up for America is to lose companies who might go and headquarter in another part of the world. So this is where Janet Yellen comes in as Treasury Secretary. She's obviously on the same page as Joe Biden, as you would expect, but she wants to try and rally and harness lots of countries to join onto a regime which agrees that there will be a floor, a minimum for company tax rates around the world, and that no country should be allowed to go below it.
Hundreds of demonstrators have gathered in Germany's capital to protest against coronavirus measures imposed to help curb a third wave of infections. About 300 people rallied at Berlin's Brandenburg Gate against the lockdown, criticising the latest restrictions for apparently infringing on their rights. On Friday, a nighttime ban on gatherings was imposed in the city, the first time since the beginning of the pandemic a year ago. Other cities in Germany have also imposed limited curfews. Former Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein has asked a New York appeal court to throw out his convictions for sexual assault and rape and to grant him a new trial. Weinstein says the trial judge in his case made several errors that denied him an impartial jury. He was sentenced in March 2020 to 23 years in prison for assaulting former production assistant Mimi Haley and raping former aspiring actress Jessica Mann. The conviction was seen as a watershed moment in the Me Too movement against sexual abuse and harassment. Well, the Pacific Island nation of Samoa goes to the polls this week in an election that could seriously test the government for the first time in decades. Thousands of Samoan and Australian dual citizens usually fly home to cast their ballot, but COVID restrictions means this time they won't be able to take part. So they are finding other ways to participate.
If it wasn't for the pandemic, Parise Vincent would be in Samoa right now, preparing to vote in the upcoming election.
I'm sad, because I was so looking forward to it, and there's a big reason why I want to be there, especially this election, because this is like a life and death in Samoa.
There is no absentee voting in Samoa, so the dual citizen is showing her support in other ways instead, attending political fundraisers in Sydney.
I can't vote, I can't go there, but whatever fund that I provide from this end, that is my voice.
There are twice as many Samoans who live overseas in countries like Australia, New Zealand and the US than inside the island nation. But travel restrictions mean none of them will be able to have their say when Samoa heads to the polls on Friday. The ruling government has been in power for nearly 4 decades, but this time round faces fierce competition from a new opposition party called FAST.
There's been a very limited political opposition to the ruling party until now, but the point of FAST is that it has a lot of really significant political actors who are well known throughout Samoa and in the broader region.
Li'i Anai's cousin is the deputy leader of the FAST party. With borders shut and her cousin unable to travel overseas, she's been fundraising on his behalf.
The funds are going to help them with their last-minute preps, for their campaign.
While they won't be able to vote on election day, the local community will still be keeping a close eye on the result. Many Samoans will be gathering at community events across the country on Friday.
Yeah, I'm taking a day off. Yeah. This is very important.
To watch a landmark election in their homeland from afar. Lydia Feng, ABC News, Sydney.
A rising number of COVID-19 variants are putting vaccine efforts at risk of being upended. There are at least 3 documented variants of concern that have gripped several countries since December. And experts say the global vaccine rollout might no longer be enough to contain them.
Mutations of the virus that causes COVID-19 are common, but only some have been dubbed variants of concern, meaning they're more transmissible, cause a more severe disease, or can reinfect people who've already had COVID or been vaccinated.
COVID-19 is 30,000 letters long, and a variant might just be when one of those letters are different, or it might be when a letter is missing or a letter's been added.
5 of these variants have been documented so far. The most concerning are those first detected in South Africa, the UK and Brazil. The South African variant has been found in at least 48 other countries. The UK variant accounts for almost all of the cases there and is now present in 114 countries. But it's the P1 variant that has doctors worried. Infections and deaths have surged to record levels in Brazil, which could overtake the US as having the world's worst death toll from the disease. The average age of people hospitalised last year was 65, Now doctors estimate it's around 37 years old. That's thought to be because of the spread of the variant. These variants risk undermining the effectiveness of vaccines.
We need to stay ahead of the game, so we need to sequence, we need to understand what the genetic changes mean biologically, and then tweak our vaccines so that we can remain ahead of the virus evolution and what that's likely to throw at us.
Research suggests the AstraZeneca vaccine is less effective against the South African variant, but works just as well with the UK one. But there's a possibility that variants could emerge in the future that are different again.
So there's one possibility that we've seen the worst of it and that we've seen most of the mutations. An alternative is that there will be more mutations to come that we might be concerned about.
Scientists say the vaccines will have to be modified to fight these emerging variants. It's a key reason we might need an updated COVID shot each year.
Well, California's famed Carlsbad flower fields are in full bloom, wowing visitors with bright and beautiful colours. The fields north of San Diego showcase more than 70 million flowers and create an annual spectacle when the flowers bloom together. It draws visitors from right across California and beyond. Well, these days, thanks to the internet, it's not difficult to listen to radio stations from the other side of the world, but picking up an analogue signal is a very different story. Radio enthusiasts often try to dial into frequencies from as far as possible. One of them is Paul Walker. Now, he's a broadcaster from a small village in Alaska in the United States. And a few days ago, he heard the ABC News radio theme, which was broadcast from Hobart, at least 13,000 kilometres away.
We are 375 kilometers northwest of Anchorage. We are not on the road system. Internet here is satellite only. I have a list of stations in the South Pacific region of the U.S., and I started hearing English language talk on a frequency I wasn't used to hearing it, because I usually hear Chinese, Japanese, whatever, and hearing English here was a tip-off. Something was different. So I pulled up my list, and there were only one radio station in the entire country of Australia that was an ABC local radio format station. And as you said, that sound you just played is unmistakably ABC local radio. I've been in broadcasting myself for 18 years, but it's the magic of how radio signals work that got me interested in radio. I've been tuning around distant signals for 25 years, and it just fascinates me, despite the magic of the internet, how I can go outside when it's dark and hear stuff halfway or all the way across the world.
Olympic hopefuls yet to qualify for the Tokyo Games have another hurdle to overcome. The governing body for aquatic sports, FINA, has cancelled qualifying events impacting hundreds of competitors in synchronised swimming, marathon swimming and diving. It's thought the high COVID infection rate is partly to blame. North Korea now says it will not be sending a team to protect its athletes from coronavirus. And there's been a major upset in the Women's World Surf League in Newcastle today. World number one Australia's Tyler Wright has been knocked out of the competition in a day marred by sloppy surf conditions.
Not even gloomy skies could keep the crowd away.
I was very keen to see Stephanie Gilmore and Isabella Nichols. I just think they're awesome and really cool role models.
It's great watching my kids and all the kids, you know, just have the opportunity to meet the surfers.
After a 4-day halt due to flat conditions, the Newcastle leg of the World Surf League has restarted.
It's just slightly pushed the requirement higher.
Australian Stephanie Gilmore is now through to the quarterfinals.
I had all this speed, but it's kind of so flat that there's sort of not too much pushback to be able to lay into it, but I don't know, I just held on.
But it didn't go to plan for Australia's other top seeds, with Tyler Wright and Sally Fitzgibbons both shock exits.
They turned out in force to cheer her on.
All hopes were riding on the local wildcard.
Yeah, pretty bummed with my performance. Kind of had a game plan, felt pretty good.
obviously up against world champion Carissa.
But it wasn't to be.
She was definitely a threat out here, and having all the local knowledge and the local support, so I definitely did not take her lightly.
The competition's down to the final 8 women, but with more stormy weather on the way, organisers are at the mercy of Mother Nature. Carly Cook, ABC News, Merewether.
Let's take a quick look at tomorrow's weather. It's going to be a wet day in Brisbane and Sydney, patchy cloud over Darwin and Cairns, a clear day for Adelaide and Alice Springs. Now, a few showers for Canberra and Townsville, slightly overcast in Melbourne and Hobart, sunny and a top of 38 degrees in Broome, cloudy and 26 for Perth. Our top stories tonight. New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern has warned travellers there might be disruptions from April the 19th when the Trans-Tasman travel bubble will kick off. A senior official at the European Medicines Agency says there is a link between the AstraZeneca vaccine and extremely rare cases of blood clots, but that there was uncertainty about exactly what was causing the reaction. And the Kremlin says Alexei Navalny will receive treatment in prison if he is ill, but the opposition leader claims his doctor has been denied access. And that is the program for tonight. You can see more world news and interviews at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Bev O'Connor. Thanks for your company. Bye-bye.